Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Today's episode is going to take on a little different flavor. Yes, we'll have some guests that I'll introduce in a moment, but we're also going to try and do more than just talk about cybersecurity problems and solutions. We're going to show you one particular tool that can impact a number of your security planning, training, and discovery strategies. While tabletop exercises are nothing new, we're going to show you how they're evolving and can be customized according to your needs. We're going to tackle the human element of cybersecurity by discussing communication strategies, and we'll offer some insight on getting greater buy-in from throughout the organization, including the C-suite and those controlling the purse strings. So without further delay, we're delighted to have Navroop Mitter, the CEO and founder of ArmorText, with us. His firm is a leader in secure, out-of-band communications. Joining him is Matthew Welling, a partner at Crowell and Mooring's Washington, D.C. office, where he works in the firm's Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. We're also excited to have Timothy Chase with us. He's the director of the Manufacturing ISAC, a nonprofit organization and leading provider of threat intelligence sharing solutions. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to Security Breach. Hey, getting things going here, Tim, I want to start with you a little bit and just talking about some of these communication challenges that we have within the manufacturing sector. I mean, we're going to be talking about stuff in response to cyber attacks, but really there's some issues with cybersecurity that can happen before, during, and after. What are some of the things that you're seeing as maybe the biggest obstacles or biggest challenges and how folks are dealing with it?
Yeah, great question. So I think we're going to get into some of the specific challenges and where definitely manufacturing as an industry can grow, both during and after, and where sort of secure comms plays a part. I'd actually say from a manufacturing ISAC perspective, one of the things since we started the ISAC and are really sort of engaging the industry is that unlike some other critical and vital infrastructures, manufacturing really doesn't have sort of the muscle memory of sort of information sharing, both externally between sort of, government partners, manufacturers themselves, industry, but also sort of in their own organizations. And so we sort of have to start from the ground up to sort of bring them together, right? And then when we do that, then it provides opportunities to kind of help them think through security-related incidents, incident response, and kind of where secure communications fits into that. And then additionally, kind of just generally more about sort of cyber incidents where, they're very adept at understanding safety incidents, very strong culture in that. And I know that a lot of people have come up with ideas like maybe we can call it, instead of cybersecurity, we'll call it cyber safety or something, But anyway, yeah, I think that's kind of from a baseline, one of the challenges that over time we need to overcome.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And that's a great comparison as to safety and something that we talk a lot about in the industrial sector, and there's a lot of parallels that we can draw from. Navroop, I wanted to talk to you a little bit too about this term out-of-band communications. It's something that we all should be familiar with, especially when we start talking about cybersecurity. Everybody has a little bit different take when it comes to vocabulary sometimes. So I thought maybe you could walk us through a little bit about that, out-of-band communications, what it means, and sort of where we are in the industrial sector with really implementing those types of strategies.
Well, let's start with the last part first. When we think about Dragos, there should be a household name in the manufacturing and OT sectors. They have a dedicated tabletop exercise practice, and one of their most recent findings that they shared at their forum in Europe earlier this year was that of all the tabletop exercises they ran, 70% had a failure with respect to how they would communicate during an incident. And that means a complete lack of identification of an out-of-band capability for communications. Out-of-band communications are what you would turn to when your Teams, your Slack, your day-to-day in-band communications capabilities have either come down or are otherwise compromised, right? An example of what might lead to that. If an attacker like a Lapsus or Scouted Spider or someone else were to be on your network and they had control of your identity provider, they might use that to either block access to all of your existing communications capabilities, your email, your chat, your video teleconferencing services, or they might use it to provision their own access in. So no matter where you go to communicate about this incident, so you can start your remediation efforts, they can follow you and listen in.
Interesting. Now, I'm looking forward to diving more into that. Some of the things we're going to go into later in this episode should be fun. Matt, I want to kick it over to you for a sec here. You've got one of the more interesting backgrounds of anybody we've had here on the show. One of the things I was hoping you could really weigh in on here is some of the regulatory efforts that have been taking place over the last couple of years, and maybe what you see as some of the biggest impactful regulatory, the regulations and things that have been put in place?
Hey, yeah, thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here. Before I get started, I got to do the lawyer thing just really quickly. Remind everyone, I'm here in my own capacity. I'm a partner at Crowell and Mooring, which is an international law firm, but all my comments today are my own. And just want to remind everyone, nothing in this episode should be construed as a legal opinion or legal advice. We're going to talk about a number of examples and some situations, and it's intended to be, some examples to be helpful, but this shouldn't be treated as an exhaustive list. Every incident, every one of these scenarios is a little bit like a snowflake. It's a little unique, and the facts matter. With that in mind, anybody who finds themselves in one of these situations, because this is a shifting landscape, is one of the things we're about to talk about. It's important to kind of talk to appropriate counsel at that point based on kind of the facts of your situation. So kind of with that out of the way and doing the lawyer thing up front, happy to talk about my background. I come from a technology background first. I was a developer for a number of years for IBM and Accenture, and then traded in that perfectly reputable career to become a lawyer. And since then have really kind of been in this space, and for the firm I'm at Crowell, been a part of this practice as long as it's existed as sort of a standalone practice. But before that, really spent a lot of my early life as a lawyer in critical infrastructure and kind of the intersection between technology and kind of the unique regulations and space for heavy manufacturing and the power sector and others. And through that, kind of have a view on this and have been a part of this landscape as it shifted. And really, we've gone from a landscape where, was the breach was the thing, or the incident was the thing that you hope never happened. And when it did, it was really a circle the wagons moment. Now we're really in a different landscape, especially over the last 5 to 7 years, where incidents are things that companies are working through on a fairly regular basis. And we've entered a place where there is a recognition from law enforcement and from regulators that these companies are the victims. They're victims of a crime. But because of a lot of the visibility on this with stakeholders, shareholders, and others, companies are expected increasingly to work through these incidents in kind of a programmatic, repeatable way, in line with whatever their specific regulatory obligations might be, and to do that on the basis of some documentation they have in place and some response plans or other things. So it's not just the ability to do it and to respond, but to do it in a way where you can demonstrate that you responded in a planned way, that you met your compliance obligations and others. And that really is the big direction of evolution that we've seen, especially lately.
Matt, have you felt like from what we've seen in some of the bigger manufacturers, some of the bigger industrial hacks, the SEC regulations have really played a big part in terms of almost forcing this layer of transparency on the sector? Do you think there's been something that's been as big, or is the SEC one kind of the big regulatory push that's maybe impacted a lot of things?
It's certainly one of the big pushes, if not the big one. It's certainly the one that's gotten the most headlines of late, because it affects the largest public companies in the U.S. and by kind of extension the world. And it's a clear line in the sand that this is the direction regulators seem to be going, which is leaning towards transparency, towards disclosure. And I think in the security community, we were already seeing a movement in that direction, where there was I would say over the last 5 years, a bigger push towards transparency. Here's what happened. But the SEC rules certainly put a stamp on it, and kind of post those rules, the immediate response has been for companies to really lean into that disclosure. And we're seeing that. I think we'll continue to see some evolution to exactly what the rules require, but certainly that has been a very clear signal to the market. And we're seeing other regulators, if not directly following suit, definitely taking a cue.
Absolutely. Tim, that kind of takes me back to a question I have for you. We have had more transparency because we've had to. A lot of folks are kind of forced to share information. What have you seen as maybe some of the biggest lessons learned from the industrial sector in going through this, whether it was Colonial Pipeline or some of the other bigger headline sort of drawing attacks? What are we learning here?
Another great question. Picking up on something that Matt just mentioned, and you brought up about the regulatory compliance, SEC specifically. So one of the good things, there's always been, or for a long time, an SEC requirement, an 8K disclosure, for incidents. But I think that the newest kind of SEC requirements are actually getting or trying to get ahead of the problem a little bit, in the sense that they're requiring certain roles in an organization for someone to actually fill that role, and that a name is attached to that role. Someone has to wear that hat for compliance purposes, which means at sort of an executive level, someone owns that now. And that has been probably one of the biggest things to actually for that executive team, that board, to understand that that risk exists and that someone is owning that, which means now someone's sitting at the table and has to think about that and bring that to their attention. So in terms of like issues, for the industry, I think that one of them is just what I said. It's just like executive awareness of the issue itself, which I think over time compliance is kind of helping to expedite that. But also, as you mentioned, really bad incidents are also helping to bring that to the attention.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel that the executives don't always learn the right lessons from bad incidents, and so I think that that's part of our challenge, is to make sure that they're connecting the right dots when something bad happens, so that they're better prepared. Because sometimes if the lesson isn't learned correctly, then they can double down in an area which is not actually going to help them in a future state, future incident. So that I would say that that's probably one of the bigger issues.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about buy-in, and it seems like it runs really hot and cold in the industrial sector. You've got some enterprises who have bought in and they get it, and others who are still sort of putting their head in the sand a little bit. Navroop, going over to you, I mean, there's a lot to respond there. Feel free to jump in on any of those topics, but I know for a fact, just in trying to set up this conversation, you've been real busy with ArmorText. You guys have had a lot of great things going on and developing some pretty cool strategies. So maybe you could fill us in on some of those things and how you're responding to some of the stuff that Matt and Tim were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Matt and Tim definitely brought up the fact that the SEC is now involved, right? The SEC is providing guidance around, the fact that there has to be an executive who owns this problem at the board level. The reality is it's not just taking place in the US. This is a worldwide phenomenon. If we think about Europe in particular, right? The NIS2 directive just went into play. The various member states of the EU did just write it into law, and it went into effect here in the middle of October. Coming up in January, we're going to have DORA, and each of these sets of guidance, these directives and regulations, as they get adopted into member state law, they're also prescribing, an ownership of this problem at the executive and board level. In fact, they're going even a little bit further. In some cases, they're actually prescribing things like out-of-band communications. Now, they're not necessarily using that term, but they are actually describing the functional characteristics of the kinds of communications capabilities you're going to need during an incident. They're describing some of these security controls like end-to-end encryption that you're going to need in order to be able to communicate securely without the watchful eye of your adversary. And they're also starting to describe how it is you're going to have to be able to intercommunicate or federate with those outside of your organization, right? Those stakeholders that Matt and Tim were talking about, right? The shareholders, the folks that you have to provide a disclosure to, the other, law enforcement parties that you're going to be engaging with, potentially your digital forensics and incident response providers. They're starting to describe all of those things because they want to improve operational resilience across sectors. And of course, manufacturing is one of those critical sectors that's been identified by all of those parties. And so we're quite busy being on the road discussing two things. One is this idea that executive preparedness, needs to be taken more seriously. Previously, tabletops were often run for more of the technical audience within the enterprise, right? The nerds in the basement. Let them deal with it. They'll figure it out, right? They'll run through the scenarios. They'll be good. They'll know how to pull log files when we need them. But executives and boards were often unaware as to what their role was during an incident, right? Who's going to be providing communications to the public? Who's going to be interfacing with shareholders? Who's going to be interfacing with law enforcement? Who's going to be talking to the regulators? What is HR's roles? What does finance have to do with all this? And so we're spending a lot of time talking about cyber preparedness, but from that executive and board perspective. Simultaneously, as we talk to sectors like manufacturing or pharmaceutical or telecom and others, where there's a heavy OT component, we're also talking about the fact that not only do you need out-of-band communications, you also need an out-of-band delivery mechanism for certain key insights that are coming off of your OT side of the infrastructure. And so we're talking about our secure gateway product. We're spending a lot of time talking about crisis response reserve capacity. How is it you're going to expand environments from an operational resilience perspective to now encompass all of the other parts of the business that might have a need to communicate in order to continue operations as well. And so we're spending a lot of time on the road discussing all of those areas.
So Navroop, I follow up here, and any guys can chime in as well. Do you think a lot of this guidance, whether it's regulatory, whether it's best practice, whatever the case may be, is offering a little bit of clarity in terms of the types of tools that the OT landscape needs? Because it seems like there is just an influx of options out there, and that can create a lot of problems too in terms of the right areas to invest in, which tools to have, make sure there's not duplication, all that type of stuff. So is some of this offering more clarity, or is there still a lot of mud in the water there?
So look, I'll start it out, and then I'll let Tim and Matt chime in. Ultimately, I don't think regulators are ever going to be so prescriptive as to say A, B, and C are the 3 technologies you need. You don't need anything else. We're never going to get that kind of clarity of guidance, right? Ultimately, they're going to look to your organization to say, hey, we understand our risk profile, our risk appetite. Here are the technologies we need to support, both the infrastructure, the people, the processes, and the technology that we have as an organization. And so they're going to look to you to figure that out. Now, thankfully, they are starting to at least provide some better guidance around what kind of characteristics you may want to consider for the different technologies that you adopt, so that you're not flying blind through that situation.
I'll jump in there for a second. I think Navroop kind of hit the key point on the head. It's not just a technology issue. It is that old triumvirate, right? People, process, technology, and it's how you're taking your technical tools and incorporating it into your processes to deal with these issues. And that goes to the point Navroop just made a moment ago about executive buy-in, executive involvement in this, because while some of us are still nerds in the basement, it's more than just the technical teams are dealing with. This is an issue that has to be dealt with kind of up and down that chain of command. It's the old joke, right? If you have 2 computers and an internet connection, congratulations, you're a cybersecurity company. And that really goes to this point. It's not for any one part of the sector, one corner of the sector, any more than it's one corner of the enterprise. It's how are kind of these people, process, technology issues being put together and addressed across the enterprise kind of to this end. And are you able to do it in a repeatable, programmatic way where you can kind of show your work? This is our plan going into it. Something happened. This is how we followed our plan and why that was appropriate.
And actually, I think Matt brings up a really important point, right? And it's that when we think about the shadow IT that oftentimes everyone is so concerned with, oftentimes there's this assumption that the shadow IT is coming into play from the IT folks. It's them not wanting to use the officially sanctioned tools that the enterprise has bought, and so they're using things like their WhatsApp or their signals on the side, potentially to communicate during an incident. What we've actually been finding as we've been talking to executives is that they too have been introducing shadow IT, unbeknownst to the other parties in the organization, because as executives, they also found suddenly a need to, light communications back up in order to continue working through incidents. Or that what they found was that day to day, they actually needed almost like a classified tier of communications distinct from the everyday communications channels that they're on. Something they don't necessarily need the assistant or the admin to see, but they do need to be able to communicate to their peers about. And so they're also introducing those kinds of shadow IT applications into the mix. And with neither side really disclosing that that's what they're going to go turn to, it can't necessarily be properly accounted for in both your compliance, but also the rest of the plans and procedures that you lay out, right? So that you have that muscle memory, because no one's actually practicing with the shadow IT tools at that moment because they're not trying to admit that they've done that, right? So there's quite a few things like that that I think are being addressed right now as people start to open up a little bit more in the kinds of tabletop exercises we're seeing today.
Yeah, let me add a couple comments. So first of all, I want to go on record saying that the nerds in the basement are my favorite people. Love.
I am the nerd in the basement, guys. By the way,
yeah.
That is a self-effacing.
Sounds like a manuscript right there or something.
Right. I'm literally in my basement right now as a nerd.
I knew you were. But that's where you have the cool light set up. And I'm the only one who doesn't have the cool lights. Matt's got the cool lights, and Navroop's got the cool lights. But on the technology piece, there's something that maybe I'm letting the cat out of the bag a little bit, because I think that Navroop and Matt and I might go on to create some manufacturing specific tabletops where some of these are in play. But one of the things that I've noticed is when you're reading those 8Ks from manufacturers, right? When you read enough of them, you can sort of read between the lines to see what they're actually disclosing. But they all kind of have a formula that they follow. because all of them have, instituted their incident response plan, whether they had one before the incident or not. It's been instituted outside, their outside counsel, their cybersecurity firm, incident response is on board. Law enforcement's been notified. But they always say that they've only had an IT intrusion. They never talk about kind of the OT side. They're very quick to say that it's only IT. But oftentimes you've noticed that production actually stops at some of these manufacturers. And so you have to question, well, what's up? If only IT was affected, how has the OT space gone down, the manufacturing? And I think one of the Achilles heels is that oftentimes in life where you get a lot of value to do something good, that good thing can also in the same corresponding way be used kind of to for bad ends. And one of those things is sort of ERP systems inside of manufacturing, where that ERP system is tracking from promotion all the way to fulfillment, including the OT space, where orders and design criteria and stuff are located in that. And that ERP system is technically IT. It's not the manufacturing floor, but some of that information that's in there is critical to actually fulfilling and making the actual orders. So we're seeing that that has having effect, and that sort of highlights where that out-of-band communication that's not the ERP system and it's not connected to things inside of your domain that you control, or a SaaS platform that's connected to that, is going to be vital if you're going to continue to not only manage the incident, but also to continue to manufacture during the incident.
Yeah, that's right. Look, if you can't communicate, you can't remediate. If you can't communicate, you can't operate.
No, well said. And Tim, those are some great points. I'm just thinking back to that Toyota facility in Japan. I believe it was late last year. They got hacked into. It was their inventory management and billing software that got hacked. Well, it's pretty tough to make cars when you can't find parts for them. So all of those things definitely bleed together. So Matt, circling back to you, we've seen all these challenges, including one where it seems like we even have communication issues when it comes to communication tools. So there's a lot of different challenges we can try to solve here. What have been some of the more effective solutions that you've seen folks implement?
Honestly, I mean, not to be self-serving about our topic of the day, it's having practiced it. And different sets of solutions are going to work for different organizations, and it's usually not just a single platform issue, because while we're obviously big fans of our friends at ArmorText, hoping Navroop doesn't kick me under the table to say there are other platforms as well. It's more important to have a plan on how you're going to use them. What are going to be the controls that you're thinking about as you're thinking about your audience? What does safe mean for different platforms you may have? Because if you're, a fully integrated team shop, for example, that's part of your enterprise networks. And there's nothing wrong with Teams. I mean, we use Teams, and so do a lot of our clients. It's a great tool. But it's a tool that's integrated with a lot of other things, and that's something to be thinking about as you're using it. The same with Zoom and a lot of other corporate communications. For a lot of efficiency reasons, they are integrated with a lot of other systems. And depending on the nature of the facts you're dealing with, that may be a system that you're comfortable communicating with, or you may want to have an alternative path. You're thinking about, is everybody remote? If you're an organization which is a large percentage of remote or hybrid workers, you're going to have probably a different set of options than a company that's largely on site still, where you can have sort of true interpersonal communications that aren't going through an electronic platform. And understanding your organization, what options you have on your menu, and when to select those options is really the best path forward. And what we found is one of the highest value, most efficient ways to do this, especially in kind of a time constrained way, is to practice it. And in practicing it, you'll find to shake out, well, if systems A and B are down, we've also lost system C, which happens to be our corporate communications platform. But if A and B are up and, our issues somewhere else, maybe that's still, up and running. We don't have integrity questions, et cetera. And it's in working through that we really see a lot of this shake out.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to do next year. I'm going to sort of turn it over to Navroop. Now, our goal here for this episode is not to sell you on ArmorText. Our goal here is to expose the strategies and the benefits that can come from this type of exercise. So, Navroop, maybe you can walk us through a little bit what you've got set up here, and then I'll kind of I'll kick it over to you for you guys to go through the tabletop.
Yeah, 100%. So the tabletop exercise guides that we co-published with Crowell and Mooring are by no means an ArmorText sales tool. They're actually written as a vendor agnostic guide. Both the Q4 2023, now the Q2 2024 guide, and the upcoming Q4 2024 guide are all written with this in mind, that you need to run a tabletop exercise. You need to be better prepared at the executive and board level for all of them to understand what their roles and responsibilities are during incident. You need to simulate different types of incidents, different types of activities that might need to take place, answer a whole host of questions that typically weren't being answered when it was just us nerds in the basement doing the tabletops. Or when along the way, you might need to figure out what you have to do from a comms perspective. But even when we discuss the comms components, we're actually talking about functional issues that may arise depending on how you communicate or what choices of comms capabilities you do or don't have available. And in the process of that, if you start to examine your requirements, yeah, you might come to settle on saying, wait, I do need an out-of-band capability. Oh, wait, I do need one that's completely disconnected from our infrastructure, that is end-to-end encrypted, and that still allows me to meet my compliance requirements. And then you might wind up talking to someone on my team like Matt or Mo or Jennifer or anyone else about, what those specific use cases are where we might be able to help. But looking at the tabletop guide itself, right? So when we published this with Crowell and Mooring, it was really aimed at that executive audience. What we wanted to do was provide them an easy, lightweight entry point into, doing their first set of tabletops, so they could start to take on that ever-expanding role where they're being asked to provide greater oversight for both cybersecurity and incident response, right? I was speaking with a board member last night of an ed tech company here in DC, and suddenly this is top of mind for all of them. They have a member of the compliance committee who historically has been who they turn to the audit committee who they turn to about cybersecurity. And suddenly that gentleman is saying, well, I may not be the best suited for this long term. We need to bring someone else on board, but collectively, we also all need to be better prepared. These guides are meant to be a lightweight entry point into doing exactly that. And so when we think about these guides, what we did is, rather than give you a script that is specific and, kind of locked in for time immemorial and is going to always lead you down just a certain path, what we did is we created a Mad Lib style guide here, right? So each module, if I think about the anatomy of the exercise, and I'm going to shift my attention over to a slide that you guys can probably see now on the screen, what we've got is a customizable scenario at the very top. Inside of that customizable scenario, you'll see certain highlighted or underlined sections that tell you what to fill in order to better tailor this exercise for your specific organization. That's then followed by a series of prompts that are organized by categories of consideration, right? So who can initiate the plan? Who can declare that we're formally in an incident? You'll also notice that every one of these modules is also marked with a CC by NC marking, right? And what that really just means is we've effectively open sourced or Creative Commons licensed these guides out. So you are free to use them in any way that's best suited for your organization. We want you to rip them apart. We want you to take these apart, use them like Legos, mix and match the components with other exercises you're already using. And so in addition to the tabletop module, the prompts, you'll also see a series of injects. And those injects actually allow you to introduce some interesting gameplay into the exercise, right? They all think they're headed down the right path, and suddenly, boom, here's an inject you need to consider, particularly about communications. A, B, and C has now happened. An executive has walked out the door. How do we pull their comms back? We just discovered Sally in IT is actually the leak to the press. Well, how do we deal with things like that? These are the kinds of injects that we provide you some foundation for. They're little mini scenarios, and then they come with mini prompts of their own for things that you need to consider that'll help you elucidate what requirements you're going to have for the comms capabilities that you'll need during your incidents. First up, we've got a slide here that you're going to be looking at on the screen. And folks, if you're following along here, what we've got is the basic overall cadence of what this particular module looks like as an exercise, right? So this module is taken from module 1 of our Q2 2024 guide. Rather than just having a single scenario there with a set of follow-up questions, this scenario is actually broken into 3 parts. And part of that is to address kind of that timeline artificiality, that big bang, right? Oftentimes folks think that an incident just takes place like it does in the movies. It's all at once, big bang, everything happens, all facts instantaneously, and now you're just dealing with things. And the reality couldn't be further from the truth, right? So that couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is you're going to be dealing with, information in imperfect bite-sized chunks along the way. Information is going to be coming in, new things are going to be becoming known. And as you do, you're going to have to be reassessing some of these same questions. And so the cadence we've laid out is part one, you'll see the initial indications of compromise. You might then want to look through some of the considerations that have been laid out, right? Those questions on who initiates the plan, HR, finance, legal, all of those roles. But you also may want to practice some of the injects. And then part two happens. Suddenly, high value exfiltration has been confirmed. Again, you might have to reassess some of those considerations around HR, finance, and other areas. But you also need to now run some new injects, particularly around communications, because now the scenario is one in which, there's more likely leak that's about to go take place, or more likely intrusion that's about to go take place. And then finally, part three, the reputational impacts, and then kind of reassessing from there as well. And so with that cadence in mind, again, on the screen, you'll be seeing module one in its unedited form. You'll be seeing the pink underlines in the fill in the blanks. But I'm going to read you the scenario that Tim Chase has customized for us and for the manufacturing sector. So your company's IT department detected the installation of unauthorized remote access software on multiple employee workstations. The help desk has seen a spike in calls from employees whose multi-factor authentication, or MFA, is no longer working. Multiple system administrators report that they are unable to log into their accounts, but the accounts appear to be active and in use. On further inspection, it appears that compromised administrator accounts have been used to elevate privileges for other user accounts. IT teams have identified multiple instances of unauthorized software installations, as well as unusual network traffic to unknown external destinations. Several enterprise software applications, including a company-wide enterprise resource planning ERP platform, are non-responsive and appear to be encrypted, raising alarms that ransomware deployment may be underway. This situation is evolving rapidly, and IT leadership is concerned that company email systems may not be secure.
So just taking a pause here for a little bit, guys, I could just imagine if this happens, and this is obviously a simulated exercise, but people are going to be freaking out. So maybe we can just stop right there for a second, and would you recommend, whether it's through the tabletop or in real life, responding to just that individual dynamic for people to get very emotional when they can't access something that they've always been able to get into?
Look, I think the first thing is it's got to be part of muscle memory, right? The example I often give that people sometimes hate is that if you look at Tom Brady when the Patriots were playing the Falcons in the Super Bowl, what was that? How far down were they in the fourth quarter? It was an impossible scenario, and yet they just kept playing the game, right? They stuck to the playbook, they kept executing, and eventually it just hit. It was muscle memory. They could stay that calm and not panic because they had drilled it more than anyone else, because they were so used to having to come from those conditions and just continue to execute no matter what was happening. And I think that's the biggest part of it, is develop that muscle memory before the incident starts.
Tim, is that kind of what you're seeing from the folks that you work with as well? Is it just sort of a repetition to the point where we're not freaking out because we've been trained for this, to borrow sort of a term from the military?
Yeah, I think that it's naive to think that you won't be freaking out, because you absolutely will be freaking out. But I think that it does help to kind of stay the mind in terms of like what needs to happen, so that you can resist the temptation to start pulling out hair and pulling out network cables when there's an incident like that, to take a step back and to evaluate with the information that you have, and like the whole point of any tabletop really is, I think that the best value is essentially to test assumptions. And some of those are that this is going to work. I'm going to be able to contact Steve and like IT or whatever. And the testing of assumptions leads to refinement of whatever your playbook is, right? Because then you understand that you have gaps. And so that's really what, the tabletop's value is in doing that. Excellent. And I also want to follow up by saying a tabletop is not something you do once, because that whole process is iterative. You find out the gaps, you refine your plan, you do the tabletop again. So it could be, on a semi-annual basis or something, that you're exercising that plan, and that the people, and another thing that, Navroop and Matt and I talk about is generally that those tabletops, which are trying to be representative of an actual incident, are moments where you're actually bringing together people who never talk to each other typically during their normal business operations, right? And it's important that they do, because if they don't know each other and they don't know, as Matt and Navroop have already said, like who's responsible for what, those lines of delineation, that's an important part of the exercise itself.
That's a great point. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Navroop.
I was actually going to say there's another interesting potential benefit, and that's that you actually learn what the fastest path to certain operational activities are, because in a crisis, suddenly people are trying to find the shortcuts that allow them to continue to operate. And we've actually seen some companies, as a result of both actual incidents but also exercises, suddenly find ways of refining their day-to-day processes for when they return to normal operations, because they've figured out that, hey, if we can actually get A, B, and C talking to, X, Y, Z, we can actually skip a whole bunch of the letters of the alphabet in between and actually get the same results with likely lower costs and a faster time to serve. And so these kinds of exercises help elucidate quite a bit. And that's where, at least in these tabletop exercises, we've used injects to help simulate some of those challenges, right? So I'm going to take us through one of the injects that helps kind of elucidate why all comms options aren't equal in a crisis, right? So first inject, you've got a rogue executive. So an executive is sharing sensitive information with a reporter and needs to be removed from all consumer encrypted messaging platforms, right? Your executives have already moved their comms over to a WhatsApp. Some of your cybersecurity teams have moved over to a Signal. You suddenly realize that a member of the security team who was providing insights to both the executives as well as the analysts who are dealing with the remediation and response efforts is actually that executive who is leaking information over to reporters. What do you do, right? How would your team accomplish, removing this person without centralized user management? How would you ensure that the executive is removed from all of those chats? How would you prevent the executive from accessing any future communications on these platforms? If you can't remove them and be ensured that they're now removed from all communications, how do you ensure that parties who didn't necessarily know that this was the rogue actor are also made sure they remove them whatever side channel chats that they got added to over time, right? Because oftentimes in the chaos of these incidents, or even just day-to-day operations, people get added to a multitude of chats across the environment. You aren't always aware of everyone that you've added along the way, right? It might be 6 months old by this point. There might be another 30, 40, 50 people in the room beyond whom you originally started it with. You may not even be aware that this is the person that now needs to be removed, or that they're still a part of your chats. How would you ensure the executive in question has no access to past messages, chats, or attachments? So not only can they announce anything move forward, but they no longer have access to the materials that we're going to discuss during the incident itself, anything that may have come up previously, that contract that was quite important to that key supplier or that key vendor or that key client that is sitting in that chat because it was being discussed at the time around what are your notification obligations. How do you make sure they don't have access to that information moving forward? And if you are able to wipe the communications and or are forced to shut down the entire thread, how does this impact potential retention obligations? So let's say you are on one of these platforms and it's like a Signal. You say, you know what, we're going to shut down the entire room. You shut it down. How do you ensure that now you've had actually retained everything that needed to be retained so counsel could do its job moving forward? Or in case there was an audit trail that had to be produced, that you could still produce that audit trail. Are you equipped to reconstruct an audit trail if required? And then finally, what are the measures would you take to secure those communications, right? And so these are the kinds of questions that an organization has to be thinking about if they had made the choice to move to a consumer, privacy-oriented communications application. And these are the kinds of things they're going to be discussing there. So when we think about that, right, practically, the reality is your consumer-oriented applications, they lack user management, they lack policy enforcement, and they lack any form of audit trail. And then encrypted or not, they just don't have audit trails to begin with. And that's because they weren't designed for that. They were designed to help protect consumer privacy. They weren't designed with enterprise controls in mind. And so practically, we think there are a number of additional controls that should be met. If you're in an organization where you're not going to have the ability to buy a dedicated out-of-band communications platform, and you're going to have to continue to operate something like a Signal or a WhatsApp, there's actually a checklist that we've put together of considerations, right? Logs show that the executive's account subsequently downloaded critical files related to intellectual property on proprietary manufacturing processes data and several future products that had not been made public to an IP address in Asia. And so this is not where the plant operations are taking place. This executive would not have been located there. So this customization to this scenario is really about helping continue that tailoring of the exercises Tim from the Manufacturing ISAC had done for us in part one. And it continues to focus on the loss of the ERP or the weaponization of access to the ERP, something that it is quite plausible a help desk employee would have received a request about, because there are going to be lots of executives asking each other for different types of information. And now, helpful help desk employees are probably going to want to contribute towards getting the organization back online. This is just an example of what could take place as the situation unfolds. The third part of the scenario, I'm kind of jumping ahead here now, is also been customized by Tim at the Manufacturing ISAC to kind of show what would happen if we were continuing to go on this path of the ERP platform being the challenge. And so in part three, company IT has confirmed that corporate ERP platform is inaccessible and appears to be encrypted. The company has been contacted by a ransomware operator stating that his company files and demanding significant payment for a decryption key to not post the files publicly. Company operations will be seriously hindered if the outage continues. And so the IT team continues to identify new activity by the compromised user accounts. That is the final part of the scenario. Again, here, those same facilitator prompts and questions that Matt Welling walked us through earlier are the kinds of questions you'd be walking through both at the end of part two as well as at part three, because with a change in facts, with the new insights gained, some of the answers you may have had previously would have might actually be altered or changed. You might course correct and go down a different path now.
Absolutely. Kudos to you, Tim. I mean, those are definitely some real world examples. Those are the hacks that we're hearing about all the time. So I think what this really validates too with these tabletop exercises is, like you were talking about, Navroop, getting the right people around the table, and also then putting out in situations that are real world that people can relate to and learn from, obviously, on the fly. I think there's a lot of takeaway value in terms of just running through these exercises and exposing folks to the fact that they aren't rocket science. They're pretty straightforward. The Mad Libs type approach that you were talking about makes a ton of sense, and customizing it according to your environment as well. I think one of the big things when it comes to this type of training, as well as any other, it's getting that buy-in. And we talked about that before. But when we look at tabletop exercises in particular, is there I guess for lack of a better word, a selling point that you might be able to use to get more people not just going through the motions, but more engaged in the process?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. I mean, I think one of the takeaways that we see is you really get a lot of bang for your buck from it. It's a relatively kind of time constrained exercise. It's a way to not just practice it, but you get all these side benefits along with it. You get to practice the communications. You get to sort of pressure test your policies. But it's also, it can be a little prophylactic as well on your compliance obligations. If something were to happen, it can be evidence to demonstrate that you took this seriously. That there are really a lot of benefits that you get from having done this that are in addition to the, just the act of practicing. And because of that, in a really limited amount of time, you're getting a lot of value returned, even though we're certainly aware that it's a lot of really high value time that's in these when you have your C-suite and others. But that's really one of the takeaways. And I'll say, just anecdotally, in my experience, I've very infrequently had a company that we've worked on one of these with that they haven't done another and another and another, because the value, having gone through it, becomes very apparent very quickly for the organizations that take these seriously.
So I think there's the positive side of it, absolutely. But if we think about the negative impacts of not having done one, right? The reality is, that IBM cost of a data breach study highlighted that in the wake of a cyber attack, in the wake of a breach, when organizations increase budgets, 55% of them choose to invest in better incident response planning and testing. A lot of that probably has to do with the fact that in that same study, they found that of the companies that had gone through a breach, only 12% of them had actually had a full recovery.
Yeah.
And what they also found, which is quite telling, I think, is that, of those that had a full recovery, about 75% of them, it took longer than 100 days to get there. And so the better prepared you are, the the shorter that potential time frame of having to deal with all those negative consequences that Tim talked about earlier, the impacts to the share price, the impacts to the reputation, the impacts to your ability to continue to supply the market, the impacts to continue to move forward with whatever strategy you had for the business prior to the breach taking place, right? I know we talked about one of the most critical parts of the business to bring online. One of the things that we've been talking to a lot of executives about more recently, though, is better informing that set of decisions with also look forward at what strategy are we as a business moving forward to. Is there a business unit we're about to jettison? And so should we, in theory, be placing another business unit ahead of that? Practicing through all those kinds of things as well as a part of that planning effort will help you effectively get through the incident, hopefully in a much shorter time frame, and return to normal operations in a shorter time frame, and then incur less of those negative impacts that Tim was talking about.
Yeah, downtime is death in the industrial sector. So let's get things up and running more quickly. I think that would be a very organic way to get more buy-in, especially at that C level, who is always concerned about, at the end of the day, we're a manufacturing enterprise, we need to get product out the door. So is there anything else that you might want to add, Tim, in terms of getting that C-level buy-in? We always hear about culture being such a big component of successful cybersecurity programs. We've talked about a lot of things that can get internal support, but what about at that higher level? Is there something different that we can be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about all the benefits of doing sort of tabletops and bringing that into sort of the mix of things that you're thinking about in terms of incident response planning and figuring out who's doing what during an incident, and and all of the positive benefits that flow from that. Some of the Navroop just touched on the downside of not having done that work beforehand. But I would say one of the things, and I was just, before we jump in this call, I was just having a conversation with someone. We were talking about that sort of board level issue with understanding. And I think that what I've noticed is that particularly in the manufacturing space, and particularly as it pertains to sort of information security and cybersecurity, the executives don't have the best metrics on what risk they're absorbing, right? They don't have the categories to grasp that. I think that the tabletop actually is a useful tool in helping them understand what risk they may be accepting that they didn't put in that risk category. So it just sort of, it really hits home for them. It makes it real. From then on, it helps them to right size how they approach budgets, what new strategic hires they need to make in those areas, it moves it out of a theoretical or just maybe a compliance piece into this is both business and operational risk, and it makes it a little bit more tangible for them.
Yeah, speak their language. Talking about metrics, financials, and ROI, that definitely will get their attention. Wrapping up here, guys, anything else you'd like to discuss in terms of some closing thoughts or different trends we should just be aware of in terms of incident response? Navroop, we'll maybe start with you there.
Yeah, I think more and more we're actually seeing organizations start to invest in post-breach preparedness. And I think you're seeing a definite shift in that post-breach preparedness investment, not just from companies, but also from the vendors and even the venture capitalists who finance them. And that's because I think there's finally this recognition that we can keep investing in the latest scanning technologies. We can keep investing in better firewalls. We can keep investing in better threat intel sharing prophylactically. The reality is at some point, someone is going to break in, right? Your adversary only has to be right once. You have to be right millions of times a day. And so as a result, we have to be prepared for when the enemy finally does get through the walls.
Absolutely. Matt, anything else you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to echo some of the themes that we've talked about throughout one more time, which is, you need to have a plan and you need to follow your plan in the wake of, something happening to demonstrate, how and why you did that. It's one of the things that we are hearing again and again from regulators, from law enforcement, from, opposing parties in litigation, the plaintiffs bar, all of that is, just doing the right thing isn't always enough. Sometimes it's being able to demonstrate why you did the right thing and how. And, tabletops are one way to practice that, but it's kind of a full picture here of having the plan, practicing the plan, and then following up on your plan. And as you're doing that, that really prepares you when there's an incident to put yourself in the best possible position
to defend your actions that they were appropriate, even in cases where you're dealing with, something that's never been seen before.
Yeah, good point. Tim, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, so I 100% agree with Navroop that whether it's the investors, smart money is moving towards sort of that secure comms and post breach preparedness. 100% agree with Matt that you need a plan, and so the emphasis there is that in both cases there's going to be some work prior to that incident or even a tabletop that needs to be done for that to be effective. And I agree with all of that. At the Manufacturing ISAC, what we're really focused on is that, the best incident is one that didn't happen. So we're still focused on trying to put organizations in the best place possible so that the incidents that inevitably, as Navroop says, will happen are going to be smaller and less impactful, and that some of the tools and tactics that we're talking about here, when they're operated, will actually help organizations to recover much quicker.
Thanks, guys. And for more information on these modules and a lot of what we've discussed here today, I'd encourage you to check out ArmorText.com. Also like to thank you for joining us today, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Navroop Mitter, Matt Welling, and Tim Chase, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.